so my name is Kristian Appelt. I am the Director of Auto Services Group. Auto Services Group is a fairly generic term, but that's the company name under which I operate a number of different brands. I do know some people here. I know a couple of owners, which is great. I am also a member here of the association as well, so I do support AEVA. My company, by and large, imports cars, and I'm not specifically talking about electric vehicles and hybrids. I'm also talking about in general. My role covers the entire gamut of vehicles from I assist people with vehicles that are under $10,000 at one end and up to about 6 or 7 million at the other. So I'll talk to you about some of the exciting stuff afterwards, because there are some electric vehicles coming out at the top end that you might be interested in finding out. I'm sure you know, just start saving your pennies now and you can find out about them. So Auto Services Group is the parent company. I'll just quickly flick on. Let's see if that works. I have the trading names are rather unusual, and I have Iron Chef was taken from I used to have a username on forums. I was very involved in car forums very early. My username was Iron Chef, and so my company then became Iron Chef Imports. That predominantly deals with vehicles out of Japan, and from there grew. Actually, Iron Block came after that, and that deals with cars out of the US. And then over a few reds one night, we said, what should we call the UK version? And then came, you can see Maggie's head there on Iron Lady Imports as well. So, so that just gives you just a very brief overview. I trade under another. There are another probably 4 or 5 different parts to my company. Coming soon is eGarage. So I have a trading name called eGarage, and that will deal specifically with electric vehicles and hybrids. So there's some exciting developments there. And actually, well, probably I'm giving away some of my trade secrets probably. But so there's eGarage, and there's also eFleet. So we're looking at fleet. The company that I'm working with, we're dealing with fleet vehicles as well, particularly with Uber and those sort of ride share, type arrangements. Now, just at the bottom there, you'll see there's another logo that says AEVA. It's a bit of a wordy title, but it is the Australian Imported Motor Vehicle Industry Association. We are hoping to shorten that somewhat at some point, but that is the association that represents importers of motor vehicles in Australia. You will probably know by now that all vehicles are imported into Australia. So there are 2 sides to the fence. The other side of the fence is that you've got the manufacturers and the sort of the dealer-approved logistics chains where they come in through their appointed dealers. And we operate outside that, so we are the independent, I guess, network that operates outside of the dealer, the normal dealer, the factory approved or authorised dealership network. I am the Vice President of AEVA, and as you will find out in a minute, that role grants me a lot of access to Canberra and to politicians and to heads of department and other things. So it gives me an opportunity to obviously meet and lobby. We do a lot of lobbying in Canberra. I was just saying before, I've cancelled I think 10 flights in the last 2 weeks, so to give you some idea of how regularly I'm going back and forth. So that is part of my, I mean, obviously there is a, I guess you would say I have a vested interest in it because it's my business, but there is also there's an interest in it from an enthusiast perspective as well. So, and predominantly my history is that I'm a car lover, and so my interest is in cars of all kinds. And so initially it was sports cars. Now it's broadened a lot. I take in electric vehicles as well. So from that we do have a shared interest there. So that's basically my company and how it currently sits. What thought I would do was explain to you. Try not to read ahead. Ideally, I would have put those dot points so they came down separately, but I'll just give you a quick rundown of where we're currently at with imported vehicles. And when I say imported vehicles, I am talking about vehicles that are coming in that aren't supplied through the dealership network. So we bring them in separate, through separate chains, and so you'll hear them called grey imports. Is probably the most common term you'll hear. We don't particularly like that term because it implies that there's something wrong with it where there's not. So we tend to use independently imported vehicles, and they can be new or they can be used. So it's quite a depending on who you speak to is how it's described. So there is quite a history here. It goes all the way back to 2013. And in 2013, the government said, okay, we've had the current legislation in place since 1989. It's really overdue, and I think the rules state that the legislation is supposed to be revisited every 20 years. So they were a little bit overdue even in 2013. So they did start having feedback and discussions and sort of workshops for interested parties about imported vehicles. And when I say imported vehicles, the used imported vehicle or the independently imported vehicle market only represents about 0.5% compared to new vehicles. So for give or take, has come back a little bit now, but there's roughly 1 million cars sold a year in Australia. Used imported vehicles represents about 5,000. So you're not really talking about a huge number of vehicles as it currently stands. That has potential to increase in the future, obviously. That's why we got involved. So back in 2013 we first started discussions about what's the new, if the regulations are going to change, how are they going to change? Are we going to allow more vehicles in? The general feeling was that the current legislation at the time was too restrictive, and that other countries around the world were seeing growth and I guess and access to vehicles at better prices than we are in Australia, basically because there's more competition. So when you have cars being supplied to the market much cheaper than what they are currently available, you start to see the prices drop, and then the new car dealers can't really sell their cars at the prices that they're not sustainable. They start to pull their prices back. So that was our argument, was that it was a competition issue, and that or an anti-competitive issue, I should say. In 2013, the election was held, and some of you may remember Ricky Muir. He and I are quite good friends as a result of his election. I was involved with that campaign a little, and I still hold him in very high esteem. He's a non-politician, if that makes sense. So he and I got along very well. He was a great supporter of greater competition in the marketplace, and so we found that some good synergies there where he would listen. He was always had an open door for us, and when I say us, it was still me at the time. I was basically advising him on policy, and being one of the, if you remember, the crossbenchers were quite powerful back in those days in the Senate. He was part of the tail that was wagging the dog a little bit with how things were heading there. So he was quite a powerful ally to have in our corner. In 2015, the Harper Review was released. Now the review was looking at every aspect of trade in Australia and increasing competition or reducing anti-competitive elements. And the Harper Review concluded that cars was one area where they were obviously there was a fair bit of work that needed to be done. And one of the proposals was that the government should allow any car that's aged under 5 years of age, any car should be allowed to be imported. So in other words, you go to look for your next car, you look in Australia and you see that it costs 50,000, and then if you look overseas and you see that that car only costs 35,000, you can go and buy that car overseas and you can bring it in and drive it on the roads. Subject to obviously checks on standards and safety and all that kind of stuff. So putting that aside, if the car was cheaper overseas, you could go and buy your car and bring it in. Cue the howls of protest from the manufacturers and their dealers. And so the backlash was quite swift and very strong, bearing in mind that at this stage the manufacturers were still manufacturing in Australia. So you had Ford, Holden, and the association that represents them is called FCAI, which is the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. They're very powerful politically, and approached the government and said, look, if this happens, we will actively campaign against you. The person that was most involved in that was Jamie Briggs. If any of you know Jamie Briggs, was he lost his seat to Rebecca Sharkey up in the hills up here, and they attribute, and this is in the 2016 election, and Jamie was actually he was in charge of this legislation and deciding what to do, and we had spent we'd had many meetings with him by that point, and we basically reached an agreement. But he was bundled out by Rebecca Sharkey in the elections, and things changed again, as often happens with the political climate's quite turbulent. And that was part of the reason that things tightened up again, was that the Liberal Party considered that his loss was largely due to a couple of very prominent dealers up in the hills who campaigned for Rebecca Sharkey and against him because of his stance on imported vehicles, which made them all very gun shy, and what was originally going to be quite an open process then shrank back in. So the election came around in 2016. They changed the eligibility criteria quite significantly, and improved things from our side, but obviously not quite what we wanted, but still a compromised position where we thought we could actually do quite well with it, with what they'd presented. 2018 came a Senate inquiry. I think you would remember. I think Tim Storer came here, didn't he, to present to you at one stage. We did a lot of work with Tim Storer as well, and he's another excellent politician who has since lost his position, but a very intelligent man. I went down to Mitsubishi, for those people that were involved in the inquiry. They were looking at the role of how we can increase the number of EVs and particularly hybrid vehicles in Australia. The EV take-up is very low, as you'll know, in Australia. Shamefully so, I would add. So they were looking at ways that we can increase the uptake. As you can imagine, most of the suggestions back to the government involve subsidies of some kind. And when you're looking at, I'm sure you'll all understand that when the government looked at how what are the barriers to EV ownership in Australia, infrastructure is one, price is one. They're the two main. In fact, they're the two main ones. So how do we reduce the price of new EVs to a point where people are more inclined to take them up, and how do we provide infrastructure that's going to help people remove some of the range is improving range. So we came in, AEVA came in with the suggestion that we increase the number of used imported vehicles, EVs coming in, because if you can supply cars the problem is that if you don't have many new cars being sold, you also have they're very scarce in the used market as well, because obviously a new car becomes a used car, and if you don't have many new cars being sold, you don't have many used cars to choose from when the time comes. So we approached the government, and AEVA approached the government and said, we think there is a case here that's not going to cost any money, the government any money, which is, we would think that would be a good proposition for them, because they don't like to spend it very much, to increase the numbers of used EVs coming in, because as you will probably, for those of you that own EVs will know, people are more likely to look at the option of an EV for their next vehicle if they know someone who's already got one. So we worked on the theory that if more vehicles are made available into the market and you have more people owning them, and you're looking at a price point of 20,000 rather than 50,000, it makes it a lot more attractive for people to come in and start their EV experience. And then it also snowballs. So someone, you've got your Nissan Leaf parked out the front of your house, and then from there your neighbour will see it and they'll say, oh, what's it like? How do you find it? And you go, well, it's great. I can charge it at home. I only have to charge it up once a week because I tend not to use it. All those kinds of things help to break down, dispel the myths of EV ownership. So that was what we approached the government. We said, if you can get more into the market at reasonable price points, the used EV market currently really doesn't exist. So let's fill it with more vehicles that are, more used vehicles that are at price points that people can afford. So that the proposal that we made was not accepted, but having said that, we were pushing quite hard for what we were asking for was quite a bit, and what we ended up with wasn't actually so bad. So, and finally, after 6 years of negotiations, we ended up with new legislation, although the department promptly said that we don't have the ability to implement the new legislation in time. So that's been delayed now by about 18 months. But they now have interim arrangements which allow us to bring in the new vehicles that we would have had access to anyway. So the current legislation allows for used independently, either new or used, imported vehicles to come in. Here's what the legislation looks like. So under what they call the environmental criterion, there are 6 different criteria, and the environmental criterion is, as you can see there, it's a variant. So in other words, the vehicles, probably the big change now is that if the vehicle was sold, previously if the vehicle was sold in Australia, we couldn't bring in any variant of it. So for example, the Subaru XV is an example. Only reason I know that is because I've just been doing the application for the eligibility for it. But it's sold in Australia as an internal combustion engine car. There's a hybrid variant of that that's not sold in Australia. Now under the previous legislation, we couldn't bring in the hybrid. Now we can, because it's a variant. They will allow a variant. The variant basically says that it needs to have a propulsion method other than an internal combustion engine. So it can either be in conjunction with an internal combustion engine, or it can be on its own. So in other words, a hybrid or an electric vehicle. So and then it also, the other requirements are that it also has to exceed the current emission standards of the day. So as we start to tighten up, it effectively means that the only EVs or EVs won't be a problem because they don't emit any emissions. But if it's a hybrid, that it has to be a more recent one. It can't be an old, really old hybrids. Not that there are that many around, but you still have to, the emissions, the whole point of this criterion is that to reduce emissions. So that is one of the rules. You'll notice underneath it says, down the bottom there, it says the variant has a maximum engine capacity of 660 cc's, a maximum engine output of 47 kilowatts, and you've got the dimensions there. If any of you know cars out of Japan, you'll know that there is a K class car as a class of vehicle that's quite small, and enthusiasts from our side of the fence have been pushing quite hard for these vehicles to become available in Australia, and they thought, where are we going to put this criteria? We don't know where to put it because they're not performance cars and not anything else, so they've just sort of wedged it in at the bottom of the environmental class, which they are environmentally friendly, I guess, in that regard, but I'm not really sure. That was sort of an odd mix, but we're still happy that it exists, because it gives us more options of cars that, you know, more variety of cars that we can bring in. So after 6 years, we ended up with some new legislation, and this is the new criteria. So what I thought I would quickly show you is, and feel free if you have any questions to ask along the way, what I thought I would do is quickly show you some of the cars. So as of February, we had our first list of the new vehicles that are now eligible under the new scheme. So what I thought I would do is I would show you some of the cars just so you can, just to whet your appetites. Now I will point out that the initial ones here are hybrids. I do have some straight EVs coming up pure EVs coming up at the end. So these are in no particular order other than, well, they're in an order that they were listed on the new scheme, the eligibility list. So these are your vehicles that are now eligible that weren't eligible previously, and you can, if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me along the way. Okay, this is the car that I want to buy if I can afford it. If lots of other people buy the other cars, maybe I can afford one of these. Mercedes doesn't bring out, they do have some hybrids, and they do have some plug-in, actually they do have some plug-in models as well. But if the model is not released here and it's a hybrid, we can bring these in. These are very popular in Japan, and these are now eligible to bring into Australia at prices that are about, by my very rough calculations, about $40,000 cheaper than what the current models are being sold here. So the equivalent obviously would be something like a 400D, which is a diesel model that's sold here. But yeah, on average the prices of the cars out of Japan are much cheaper, particularly, and you can imagine the higher up you go, the more you save. So that probably makes a little bit of sense that these are a lot cheaper. A little bit more down to earth, Suzuki do a hybrid Swift, and some of these you may never have realised that these were available in hybrid, but these are all available overseas. So I'm just going through these. Japan loves its hybrids, so and it's obviously made quite a significant difference. You can imagine in their major cities when the cars all stop, whenever they're stopped, the engines all turn off. That's made quite a significant difference to their air quality over there. So Suzuki Swift Hybrid is another one that we now have access to. Depending on how new they are, you can imagine if you've got a vehicle that comes straight off the showroom floor, the cost of buying that overseas plus paying your taxes on arrival in Australia means that the cost can be, in some cases, if you bought that brand new, might be more than what the equivalent Suzuki Swift is in Australia, because we've got to pay 2 lots of taxes. That's why we tend to allow, they're a better option if you leave them for 2 or 3 years where they've gone through the depreciation cycle, and we can pick them up quite cheaply at auction, and then we can bring them in and it makes more sense. So did you have a question? No? It's alright, I'll keep going. Have any of you seen these? It sort of looks like a bit of a doomsday vehicle. I think Toyota lost their way a little bit with their styling, but I will say they are incredibly luxurious inside, these cars. These are ones that are already available. If you look across the road, you'll see that there's a Toyota Grand Via, which has actually replaced that now, so which looks a little less intimidating. Yeah, the grille, I'm not sure where they went with the grille. It looks a bit like a cheese grater to me, but they're available in hybrid. They do those as a hybrid. The Nissan X-Trail is available as a hybrid too, for those of you that prefer the sort of the SUV style. And you'll see a few more. These have just become eligible now. I'm on the hunt for my cousin. She's after one now, so I said I'd find her a hybrid. So, so these have come up. Price is fairly similar to what the normal internal combustion engine models are locally. That's the same drivetrain as the S-Class I showed you earlier. Although interestingly, the prices on these aren't as good. You can say for the similar price to these, you can get the S-Class, which is a bit larger. So these initial reaction to this isn't quite as exciting as the S-Class, but they are a size smaller if you want a size smaller. Now we're getting into some of the interesting stuff. The Prius was available as a plug-in. In Australia we know it as just a standard hybrid. But there is a plug-in version that's been available in Japan for quite some time. And because the type of, because it's a plug-in rather than a standard hybrid, that's classified as being sufficiently different to allow us to import it. So if you're interested in the plug-in hybrid version of a Prius, then let me know, because these are about to hit our shores. Another Mercedes-Benz. Someone really had a go at Mercedes. I'm sure there are a few executives getting a little bit dark about it, but so the GLC 350E, which is also a plug-in hybrid, they're also available.
You get them out of Japan or England?
We can get them from either. That's actually a good question for those asking where we source the cars from. As a general rule, Japan is the cheapest. For supply and also for logistics, so the shipping from Japan is a lot cheaper than the UK. But in some cases we do pull cars out of the UK. It's interesting, the Leaf in Japan, in New Zealand is a very popular car. They sell a lot of Leafs in Japan. And I do feel weird saying Leafs instead of leaves, just so you know, it's the grammar in me. But they will source from either. So they source Leafs out of Japan or out of the UK, and they'll bring in. It doesn't really matter. It does from the perspective of the odometer looks slightly different. There are pros and cons to each. So in the case of a Leaf that comes out of Japan, the radio frequencies are different on the stations, and obviously some things are written in Japanese, which gets a little bit problematic. But the cars that come out of the UK are in miles per hour. Although these days they display both. They'll have miles and kilometres, but you have both on the odometer. But the radio stations are all the same as ours. We completely match. So there's pros and cons to each. I'll talk about that actually in a minute.
Parts, because obviously this model, some of these models won't be available.
Yep.
How are the dealers, there's rumours about Honda pulling out of Australia and there's no Holdens now, so how are you going to go with parts on these things?
It's actually a really good question, because it is quite a concern. People sort of say, and dealers, when I say dealers, the normal dealership network has washed their hands of it. They've said we don't want to have anything to do with these imported cars. I will say that strategy is different to every other country in the world. So at some point that may change, but for the time being, the dealers have said we don't want to touch these cars. Like most things, demand will often bring supply. So at the moment we're looking at how do we, I know as an association we're looking at how do we provide the support. New Zealand is a wealth of that support. Just to give you an example, one car that I owned when I lived in Japan and came back, I had one car that was the only one in Australia. And I thought, how am I going to deal with this? And I rang the Mitsubishi dealer. I was a Mitsubishi, and I rang the Mitsubishi dealer in Auckland, and they would supply all my parts within 3 days. So when I was servicing, and in a lot of cases, particularly if it's an unusual part, if you go in and you've crashed your Renault, and you go in to a dealer and you say, I need a front right-hand quarter panel for for my Renault Koleos, they'll say, well, you need to wait for it to come from France. So, you know, then you're in the same boat anyway as what we are. But we generally find New Zealand is the easiest pathway for part support. We're looking into some really exciting developments with that in terms of aftermarket industry providing parts and servicing for our vehicles that come in. But that's a little bit further down the track. Yeah, so what AEVA is, one of the biggest things AEVA is committed to is making the ownership, the purchasing and the ownership experience as equivalent to a local model as possible. So we're looking at things like warranties. You know, is the warranty matched with, you know, obviously if you buy a car here and it's got a 5-year warranty on it, can we provide that, you know, as part of the importing process? Can we provide servicing and parts? Can we change the stereos over so that when you hop into your car, it works the same as if you were buying it as a local vehicle? So all these things are things that we deal with at an association level so that the whole industry benefits, and it then means further down the track that it might open up more opportunities for us as well. Do some of you know the e-Golf? You heard of the e-Golf? They are now eligible for import. They'll mostly come out of the UK, but yeah, they're now on, so which is another good development. You would probably know the Mazda Accela as the Mazda 3. The Mazda 3 was sold as a hybrid, runs the same. The hybrid system was provided by Toyota, so it's interesting how they work together in ways that we don't always see. But they have a hybrid version where that's one in particular that I'm curious to see what prices they come in at, because I think they'll be quite good value. The Toyota CHR, fairly interesting. They've just released the hybrid in Australia, but they've been on sale since they first came out, so maybe 3 years ago. They've been on sale in Japan as a hybrid the whole way through, whereas in Australia they've just released it, so we can buy the earlier models and bring those in. The Honda Diesel, as it's known in Japan, is also the Honda HR-V in Australia, also a hybrid version that we didn't get in Australia, that we can now access. We're going to go? There we go. Okay, now we'll get into some of the EVs. You'll know the Renault Zoe. Have you seen? Funnily enough, I saw one out for the first time in Adelaide, sitting out the front of the Renault dealer on Main North Road. But it's the first time I've seen it. For any of you know the story about, do you know the story about the Zoe? How it came to Australia? So when it first arrived, I mean, for starters, it's been on sale for quite some time overseas. When it was first released to Australia, it wasn't really released to the public. They were only offering it for fleets. So for the first 12 months, no one but fleets, and even then, not many fleets took it up because they were quite expensive. They were $50,000 exercise to buy one here. And so if you go down they're now available to the public. And if you go down, I think they're around about 50,000. We can bring those in. I suspect it'll be somewhere around 15 to 20,000. So just to give you an idea of the price caps. I mean, obviously that's new versus used, but even still, it's about providing these cars at price points that people are going to find more attractive. Particularly if you combine a lower a lower access point with lots of travel. So we look at a lot of these things and go, okay, if you're a person who, for example, lives in Western Sydney, has to drive an hour each way to the city and back each day, you know, how much money can you save, and how much, you know, how can you reduce your emissions quite significantly by choosing this car instead of a normal, you know, a V8 or something like that. Not that you're probably cross-shopping a V8 with a Renault Zoe, but you get the idea, yeah? You'll know about the Nissan Leaf, and I'm pretty sure I have sold a Leaf to a South Australian member of the association, so and it was one of the first ones into the country as an import. So it was the ZE0, which is the previous model Leaf. the other interesting thing about the new regulations is that the manufacturers only have 3 months from the time a car is released overseas to bring it to Australia, which is really not very long when you think about it. So basically, if they haven't brought it in by that period, we can apply for it. In the case of the Leaf, it was so popular in Japan that they took more than 18 months to bring it out in Australia, almost 2 years. And we are able to bring out this model, which is the ZE1. We're able to bring the early models of these in as well. So, and again, they'll be at prices quite significantly cheaper. I suspect $10,000 to $15,000 cheaper than buying new here. So again, this is really about accessibility, and obviously the lower you go, Adelaide in particular, the price point, the sweet spot is around about $20,000. If you can supply cars around that money, people will have will seriously consider EVs at that price. BMW i3, now they were, I've got to remember not to touch my face. This is supposed to be I'll probably get sick or something, no. I'll keep thinking about it and stop. The i3 was available for some years and not for others, so we can actually access the i3 as well. So if you have an interest in the i3 in particular, again, these are a lot cheaper. The UK, we can access them at sort of around about the $20,000 to $25,000 mark, whereas the cheapest ones here, I think, are closer to 50. Yeah, they won Wheels Car of the Year at one point as well. This is one that I've applied for that we don't have. It's not on the list yet, but will be coming soon. Probably won't win any beauty contests, but if you know the Kia Soul that's sold here, they sell an electric version, an EV version in the UK, and that is we can access those. We can bring those in as well. There are many others, and if you think of any any EVs that aren't available here, feel free to come and tell me, because I will. We can add those to the eligibility list and get them in if there's something that you have a burning desire to import that's not sold in Australia. That's where we come in, and we actually have a lot of people approaching us saying, I like this car, I like this car. I'm not entirely convinced we can bring in any Teslas. I wish we could. But having had a quick look at it the other day, I think Tesla's got most of the variants covered, so there's nothing that we have available in Australia that's not there's nothing available overseas that we don't have access to in Australia. So their distribution model is a little bit different too, which means that you personalise everything, as you will know, Mark, with your car. You can personalise everything, so it means that every option's available and we don't have the opportunity to bring them in. And that's pretty much it. So I think from here, if you have any questions, or if you have, if you're curious as to how the process works or anything, whatever it is that is of interest to you with this side of the importing equation, then feel free to ask. Actually, that's Japan. They don't. So Japan, they don't tend to tow anything in Japan. They're not big caravan owners over there. But they can. I mean, companies like we bring in cars all the time, and we send them down to Hayman Reese or Halls or whatever, and they will quite often they'll happily fit up a tow bar to any cars if they're load rated or whatever. But a car like the X-Trail, the X-Trails have a surprisingly high tow rating, if any of you have ever used an X-Trail before, but they'll tow quite a lot for what they are. But the hybrids, I suspect, would work very well as a tow vehicle. I don't know if you'd necessarily be towing a car with it, like on a trailer, but you'd be able to tow a caravan with it for sure. So, yeah.
You import these cars from countries where there's snow on the road in the winter, where they spray with salt, which is very corrosive.
Yes.
I mean, I remember where I come from, after 10 years, you could stick a screwdriver through the beams, just rusted through.
Yeah. for the sake of the people that are listening on the video, we're talking about corrosion on vehicles. One of the parts of the process, I should point out that the process to get the car from overseas to Australia is quite convoluted. Or it's quite, convoluted is probably not the right word. Thorough is probably the best way to describe it. One of the first things that they would check, so when the car comes into the country, in fact we check it before it even leaves for obvious reasons, as you'll find out. There are two things that are big no-nos, and this is the case for the current legislation, I should point out as well as the future one, is that if the car has any kind of structural damage, so if it's had an accident that's bad enough that it's had repairs on the structure of the car, so for those cars, the chassis rails or any of the kind of the structural parts, that will be rejected. They won't allow that vehicle to be registered. And the other one is corrosion. So if corrosion has attacked the car to a point where it's affecting the structure of the vehicle, they won't allow that in. They're getting even tighter now with checking. It used to be a sort of a spot check, so the government would go around and spot check the workshops to make sure that they were doing the right thing. Under the new scheme, every vehicle gets independently checked before it goes on the road, and that's even before it gets to the roadworthy part. So we have, obviously, when we have buyers in Japan, we want to make sure that we're bringing the right cars in, because it's a real pain in the backside. If you bring a car in, you pay all the money, you've paid for a car, you've brought it in, and suddenly you've ended up with a car that's can't be registered. So there's a lot of prevention that goes in there right at the start. Where, for example, I don't buy, my company, we don't buy from Sapporo up in the north of Japan. We have that's a flat no rule there, because for that exact reason. And some of the snow areas, we know where the cars come from, so we avoid those actively, because we know it costs us. It would end up costing our customers if the cars aren't good enough.
Well, actually, I mean, if you would get a car from Norway or Sweden,
yeah.
I mean, there's so much snow, they don't spray with salt because no use.
Yeah.
But if you get Germany or Holland or England,
yeah. UK is really bad for salt. And so all cars, I mean, a lot of the cars, and funnily enough, some manufacturers are worse than others. If anyone's ever owned an old Alfa Romeo, you'll know that they're very notorious for it. Mitsubishis in Japan are the same. Now, if you ever buy a Mitsubishi, I'm not talking about those people that own plug-in Outlanders, but if you have a car that's been a used vehicle that's been around, always check underneath. With Mitsubishis, when we check a Mitsubishi, we always start underneath the car before we start looking at the top, because the top can look beautiful, and then you sort of look underneath, and then you have to scratch it off. So, but yeah, the process is quite thorough. So yeah. Yep. Sorry. Sorry. Go.
If you're importing cars,
yep.
Who owns? At what point does the buyer actually own the car? Does he take the risk of it not being able to be registered, or do you?
There are two parts to that. Well, there are two options. One is obviously you can buy it from a dealer. So we do a lot of wholesale to dealerships. So the dealer will obviously buy that, take on the risk, and then that the buyer, once the car's registered, obviously then the option there is for the person just to buy. I also run a service where I provide a flat fee. So I charge a flat fee for our service, and then that starts with the entire process. So we'll hold the customer's hand right from the start to the finish. That is my bread and butter, basically. If we're buying cars that aren't suitable, we would go out of business very quickly. And I guess this is a consequence of the internet. That if you have your reputation is very hard to build and very easy to destroy. I can tell you that I've been doing this for 20 years now. We've only had one car that's been rejected at compliance, and in that case, I bought the customer a new car because it was worth my reputation to go and do it. And I should point out that was rust in a chassis rail that we couldn't spot. So it was the chassis rail looked fine, and then there was a bit of rust around one of the holes, and the workshop that was complying it sort of poked it, and it basically put his finger through, and then we realised that it was his problem. But that was, it was better for us to wear the cost of buying a new vehicle than it was to. But in every other case, touch wood, we don't have that issue. So it pays to have good buyers in Japan.
You don't bring in batteries and transaxles as spare parts, do you?
No, we don't deal in parts. I know people that do. Batteries can be quite problematic for transport, as you can imagine. They have to go via sea, they can't go via air. Actually, I've got a story for you. Remind me to tell you about the Tesla afterwards. I don't know how much time we've got, but I will tell you a Tesla story afterwards. Yeah, so parts are not really, but there are companies that deal with that specifically. I can refer you if you want, that's fine. Yeah.
Insurance, can they
Yep.
be a little bit of a pain because they'll go, oh, it's not on our list?
Yep, they do have lists, and yes, if it's not on the list, I mean, at the moment, specialist insurers like Shannon's will be fine. We are actually working, one of the things that I'm doing with AEVA at the moment is working with Suncorp and saying, look, these are a broader, they're not necessarily an enthusiast vehicle. This is needs to have a broader range of products available rather than just putting it in the specialist box and charging more. So that's another work in progress for us. And they are quite, because of the potential numbers of this scheme, the new scheme, because the numbers will be a lot higher, they're a bit more interested in it now than they were in the past. I was going to tell you about the Tesla. I brought a Tesla into Australia before they'd even been released here, the Tesla Model S. And it was a technology expo in Sydney, and a media company whose name shall not be, I won't mention, decided they wanted to have a Tesla on display. And of course at this stage there were no Teslas in Australia, and they gave me about 6 weeks notice, and if you can imagine the time it takes to import a car, to get all the paperwork sorted, etc, etc. And I had to buy the car as well. So they gave me the task of buying the car in the US, and I found obviously they wanted it as cheaply as possible. We found a car that was what they call a, what's the name of it? It was a salvage title, thank you. Yeah, do you know this story or not? I was just checking because I have told this a few times. Yeah, it was a salvage title, so it was quite cheap. But it still looked fine, and it was only going to be on display, so we didn't worry about it too much. And it passed the window of putting it on a boat. So we had to, I said, look, we're running out of time, this is probably not going to happen, you might have to come up with a different idea. They said, no, we're going to fly it over. So it cost them around about $30,000 to fly this car in. It only took 2 days, but yeah. So they flew the car in. We had to go through all the process of getting this car eligible, not eligible, but to getting the car approved to come into the country temporarily. And then while we were doing that, in the space, it was around about the time that Tesla had started. And so Tesla was just getting set up in Sydney. And I happened to know one of the people that worked quite high up in the Tesla when they were just getting started. And they said, oh, and I said, look, can you just lend us a car? We don't know whether this other car is going to make it. Can you lend us a car? We'll pay you $1,000 a day just to leave it on display. It doesn't have to do anything. It just has to sit there, you know, because I figured that's easier than paying obviously $30,000 to fly a car in. They eventually agreed. So I said, look, you've got this car here. Let's just leave the other one in the US. No, we'll bring that over as a backup. So then we flew the other car over. It sat in a workshop. It did not get used. And then it sat there for a number of months because they said, oh, we might use it for other displays, because they had it, it was available for them to have in the country for 12 months, then it had to be exported. They said, oh, we might use it for other displays. And about 6 or 7 months later, they said, no, we've had enough. We couldn't plug it in because the US plug did not match, and obviously Tesla Australia didn't have, we couldn't run it down to a Tesla charger because the plug was a US plug and it didn't match. So basically this car sat uncharged the whole time. And then they said, look, send it back to the US, sell it, and sell it for us. So I'm okay, so here's me on eBay in the US trying to sell a car that's sitting in Australia, selling this, and had people contacting me saying you're crazy and blah blah blah. In the end, there was a bit of to and fro. The dealership that sold me the car in the first place ended up taking it back, thankfully, and they gave us our money back. But that was a very, very long and arduous and very expensive process, which I got paid. I'll admit I got paid quite handsomely for helping them out, but they never used the car once.
How come they let you fly a car with a lithium battery pack?
I think that was early on, like that was early days, and so what happened was that they didn't really know, at the time they didn't really know what they were doing, and they just approved it. So, and we didn't say anything, so we just put it in a plane. I mean, you'll know that in the early days, no one bothered whether you had batteries in your carry-on or whatever, you know. Hey?
We flew batteries everywhere.
Yeah. So, and that was how it was. I mean, yeah. Well, in those days, it was. I think it would have been 2013 or somewhere around there. You know, it was quite a while ago. They just didn't bother. But yeah, that was a very. And I still wonder how some of these people make money, the companies, when they do things like this, all for a display that never happened. So there you go.
Formula Ones get their battery cars,
Yeah.
Because they fly them everywhere.
Yeah, they do fly them everywhere too. So I'm not sure exactly how they work. Although their KERS units, I think, are a little bit different. I'm not sure how but I'm not sure. I'm sure there's some kind of dispensation or protective measures. So, any other questions? Go.
We don't pay petrol tax, don't pay. Is there anything on the cards in the future that will give us a fee for driving our cars around? You don't have to answer it.
Well, this is normally beyond my scope, but I have obviously these are the kinds of things that come up in conversation with politicians. The short answer is yes, they are, and each state will decide that. It won't be that's a state by state thing. And it will come down to registration. What I think will happen is that registration will be increased. That there are two options. One is to obviously change how the tax structure works. The other is they're looking at. I mean, they've looked at options like GPS based, where the more they monitor how far your car travels in a year and they tax it accordingly. But of course, not very many people are happy with that idea. The government watching everywhere you go. But I suspect the most likely option will be that they'll increase registration costs on EVs, specifically to counteract the fact that they're not making any money off the fuel tax. So they'll get you one way or another, I think, is probably the most realistic answer.
The weight of a electric vehicle compared to a petrol vehicle, is there much difference?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the people here would probably know. It's normally a couple of 100 kilos more. Yeah. So, and that's obviously literally the weight of the batteries.
Heavier or lighter?
Heavier. Yeah. The big difference with a like a hybrid or a straight EV is that you can work out where the weight goes. So it's not, and obviously the most obvious spot is to put it in the floor. So you'll find that the driving experience of an EV is quite good because it's at the very low centre of gravity. They make for good sports cars. I will say, if you know the company Pininfarina, they're making a car called the Pininfarina Battista. I have access to those and we will be able to import them into Australia. They'll be a snip at about $2.9 million US. If you'd like to come and see me afterwards, I can arrange a slight discount for you. So if you have an interest, let me know.
So you can then apply to bring in Koenigsegg Regera.
Yes.
And all of the other Rimac hypercars and things
Yep.
like this.
Yeah, and actually the other interesting thing is that the limited edition cars, just on what you were saying, the limited edition cars, there is a separate criteria. So you saw the environmental criterion up there before. There is a rarity criterion too, and so what happens is a lot of the very expensive cars are only made in left-hand drive. They will be able to stay left-hand drive now, In the previous, under the current legislation, they have to be converted to right-hand drive, which is obviously not very. You can imagine if you've got a couple of $1 million car, you don't particularly want to go and have some backyard bloke switch from left-hand drive to right. So now they can stay left-hand drive. So there are a lot of cars now that become eligible that weren't before that can stay left-hand drive, but very, very expensive cars as a general rule. So Koenigsegg's one of them. The Ferrari LaFerrari is another one that will become eligible under the new rules. But yeah, again, if you want to come and see me, I do specialise in the sales of those cars as well. But the Battista is an electric car. The Rimac is another one that's an electric. It's all electric. Of course, has, you know, 1 billion horsepower. You know, it goes from 0 to 100, you know, in the blink of an eye. But yeah, those. I mean, that's the kind of, as an enthusiast, I find that stuff quite fascinating. But and this is where the market's leading. I mean, people with money now are starting to say, let's have a look at some of these cars, which I find interesting in itself, because I know that the car enthusiasts traditionally have always. I equate it to mobile phones. If you remember when, most of you are obviously old enough to remember when mobile phones first came out, the only people that had them were I won't say what we used to call them, but people thought they were a bit self-indulgent, and so and it's the same for electric vehicles. Initially, that was only it's people like this group that are the ones that are the early adopters and quite fascinated by it. But we're finding now that the people that have the money to be able to buy any car they like are actually starting to choose electric, because the experience of driving an electric vehicle is actually so much better. And Mark's actually good. You're a good advertisement for it, I know. With the Tesla, but it's quite, as you'll know, it's quite a different experience to driving an internal combustion engine, and over time, once people with money start to do that, those cars will also start to flow down, and it'll spread out as well. So yeah.
Do you know much about the legislation change that the government have implemented in regard to the abolition of combustion engine, and the reason as to why they've abolished that?
In the UK, okay, so in Australia they still haven't gone down that path yet.
Only in certain areas they have.
Yeah, I mean they're looking at it. So UK definitely has, and they've actually brought theirs forward. They were going to ban internal combustion sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles. So you can imagine that the old internal combustion engine vehicles are going to die a slow death as a result. But the UK and a lot of Europe now has brought in that, okay, after a certain amount of time, no internal combustion engine vehicles, and that includes hybrids, can be sold, and that's purely emissions and climate change. Yeah.
There's a small portion of the South Australian government that have implemented a non-combustion,
Yeah.
and that's in motorbikes.
Yeah. So there are government departments obviously looking at that more seriously and saying, okay, how can we? But that also comes down to cost. And so while a lot of these things get announced, you'll find that quite often they get abandoned soon after, because again, I mean, in an ideal world, a company like me, I'd love to supply vehicles to the government and do it that way. And the other problem we've got at the moment is supply issues. If anyone's tried to buy a RAV4 hybrid, I noticed there was one sitting at the front across the road there, but the wait times now for those are 9 months. So because they're so popular, which is great. I mean, this is what's happening. If you provide it at a price that's comparable to an internal combustion motor on its own, then it just starts that ball rolling. Yeah. So who knows what will happen? I think at some point we will, but I think Australians probably will go down the hybrid path only because the distances between our cities are a little bit larger than other countries.
You haven't mentioned anything about the Chinese who make the most electric vehicles. On the BYD,
Yep.
I can't remember the figures, but I think it's like 30,000 was their price, and a right-hand vehicle is going to be here at 90,000. Is there anything you can do about that?
Within reason, I mean, obviously it needs to be supplied to another right-hand drive market. Our biggest issue is that we don't. Obviously, right-hand drive markets only represent about 30% of the world's car fleet. So if it's supplied, for example, it's supplied to the UK or Japan or New Zealand at a price that's much lower, then we can import from those countries. We can import from anywhere really. It's just a matter of that we have to make them meet the Australian rules. But if a car, so BYD, I only use BYD, but there are other companies. Look out for MG. If you're an EV enthusiast, MG is going to be releasing an EV at a much lower price this year. They're Chinese built, but the quality, from what I've seen, they seem to be quite good. But they will start to push prices down. But the simple fact is, if it's available, if the price here isn't competitive, then we will be able to bring it at a cheaper price, and it will pull prices down anyway. And this is what makes me laugh, is that for all the government support, the ideas that the government has to increase the number of EVs, the best one they did was changing the rules on the imports, because what's happening is that we're basically holding the new car manufacturers to account. Because if they want to sell a car overseas at 30,000 and here at 90,000, they can't get away with it for long, because we will import the cars and bring them in. Might cost us 40,000 to bring it in total, but then people are pretty soon they're going to realise that they're not selling any cars because there's too much of a disparity there. So yeah, it's actually quite a good sort of handbrake on manufacturers supplying cars at whatever prices they think we will stand, which is the golden rule of retail, of course. Manufacturers take the attitude it's not what it's worth, it's a matter of what the consumer will pay. And in Australia we tend to pay quite a lot. So
there's a word for that.
What's that?
It's called arbitrage.
Yes, arbitrage, exactly. So arbitrage is my we spend a lot of time looking at arbitrage and whether overseas vehicles are, whether they can be. I mean, for us, as an importer, it's a business case for us. So we look at it and go, can we make a business case for this vehicle? I mean, it's one thing to have it eligible, but it's obviously got to come in at a price that's going to be attractive to the consumer. Otherwise, and as we always say to the manufacturers who whinge and complain about the fact that we have access to these cars, we say, well, bring them in cheaper. If you bring them in cheaper, we can't compete with you. So, and that's usually how it works. Competition improving the price, yeah. So.
What's the life of a car? So, obviously you've got folks at the 3-year mark, which is about the half the price of a lease or all that sort of stuff. But if people say, oh, I want to get one in that's 10 years old, is that the end of its life and therefore not worth it, or?
That's a good question actually, because we can supply cars at that age.
Specialty cars, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the appeal drops off at that point. We don't have many people approaching us, for example, and saying we want to buy a 10-year-old EV, because most people will know that if it reaches a point where batteries are reaching towards the end of their life, then they're going to have expenses, and we will. To be frank, I would say to a customer at that point, look, there's no advantage in buying. You might get it $1,000 cheaper, but if you have to pay another $5,000 to change the battery over, then it's a false economy. So generally, we would advise people not to do that at that point. I will point out that the more vehicles that are coming in that are older, it does help. A lot of people are starting to pull them apart now and find better ways of repairing rather than just pulling the old battery out and pulling the new one in. We're finding in New Zealand in particular, there's some really good stuff being done over there with replacing cells in batteries rather than the entire battery itself. And so again, it depends on the number of vehicles coming in. So in Japan, for example, they sold 9,000, I think something like 9,000 EVs last year. So they have a very strong market. The Nissan Leaf is by far and away the most popular, but they have a very strong market over there. And so what that happens is that it sort of builds up the aftermarket industry. People start working on batteries. People specialise in them. The infrastructure gets set up because there are more cars to support it. We pick up a lot of knowledge from the guys over there. I mean, obviously when we first went looking at Leafs, so I had a customer, the Leafs come on to the system to say it's eligible for import. They've come to us and we've gone, okay, what do we need to look for in a leaf? I mean, this is always, you know, when I look at a leaf at auction, what do I need to do? And if any, do any of you own a leaf? No one owns a leaf here? You'll know about the indicator on the, is it a ZE0? What year is it? Is it the previous model or the new one?
17.
Okay, so previous model. You'll know that there's an indicator of the battery life. There are things like that. I mean, there are ways of checking, and particularly with the lower powered ones in Japan, there are ways of checking the battery life. You just have to know how to access it, obviously. And so, obviously, when we go to auction, we check that. If there's any kind of battery degradation, we leave it. It's got a number of bars on the indicator, you know, sort of a bar indicator. You know about that, yeah? Yeah. And so you can check it. And so what they generally found in New Zealand was that as soon as it started to drop, it tends to drop fairly fast. So the idea is to find one that's got a full indicator that the battery's still at full health. And that's one of the things that we check, and we don't buy the ones that aren't. So to give you an example, there are enough there in Japan, you can be fairly fussy. So. But these are all the little things that you sort of learn, and that's come about from New Zealand's experience where they've had more access to the cars. Yeah, Eric?
Early on in your talk, you spoke about e-garage.
Yes.
Explain what's going to happen there.
So e-garage will work in a similar way. So I'll have customers will bring in their own cars from Japan. I should point out I have my own staff in Japan. All right, so they go to auction, and although he's an Aussie, he's now flown back here at the moment, but we still do have staff over there that can access all the auctions. So we buy from the dealer auctions over there. So if someone comes to us and I'll say, okay, you pay the fee that you pay me is $1,100. I don't want to advertise too much, but that is following the whole process right through from the time that you buy it in Japan to the time it gets registered here in South Australia or wherever you are. So e-garage will work on the same theory. So you pay a flat fee, regardless of whether the car costs $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000. The car will come in. You might come to me and you say, look, I've got a budget, I want to buy a Leaf and I want to pay $20,000. And so an e-garage will work in the same basic theory. So we'll go and find the car for you in Japan. We'll take your budget, we'll work backwards, and we'll see how much you pay in yen, and that will be your bidding limit at auction. And then from there, it works. You know, you work through the process, and you pay in instalments as you go through. So, yeah.
And you mentioned about the radiators.
Yes.
Swap them over?
Yeah. Well, these are the things that we're starting to look at now, because traditionally, I mean, funnily enough. Not funnily enough, but our clients are generally hardcore enthusiasts, not overly fussed about the stereos. They're not your general buyer who just wants to buy a car. They specifically know exactly what they want. They know that the Japanese stereo is going to be different. They might plug their Bluetooth in on their phone, and then they're happy with that. They don't need the radio. With the cars that we're doing that are more generic, those are the sorts of things we're starting to look at. Okay, we need to change that before it comes in, so that when you hop in the car, it feels no different to driving a local one. Yeah. No other questions?
Yeah.
One, yeah. Yeah.
Chevy Volt, are you doing anything with that?
Oh, okay. I looked at these. So I had a customer approach me about. They're unusual actually, because the obviously the Holden Volt was sold. The equivalent is the Vauxhall Ampera, and then the Opel. I can't remember what the Opel version was. So they do exist overseas. In fact, the Vauxhall Ampera actually looks better than the Holden version, but they came out in a second generation. I just have to work out the build dates. So some of them may be eligible. To bring in. I just have to work on that. And they actually came out with a second generation, but sadly that was only available in the US in left-hand drive. So, and because they sold in reasonable numbers still, we can't bring them in under the criterion. They sold too many of them, unfortunately. But yeah. All right. No worries. Well, thanks very much for having me. I am around for a little while. I've got my cards there. If you, I mean, I don't know, you know, it's not my intent to sell. It's really just to sort of give you a bit of information on what's happening in the future, and sort of give you an idea where the market's heading, because there are some exciting opportunities here for you guys. But if you did want to talk to me, if you have specific cars that you're interested in or want to know more about, or if there are some that I haven't thought of and you want me to apply for, I can do that too. That doesn't cost anything at the moment, so actually it does. I pay my son to do it, so because I can't, it's kind of a drudge. So I pay him $100 and he's raking in money at the moment. He's on his gap year. He's a man of leisure, so he's sitting around doing all my applications and getting money from Dad. But if there are cars that you're interested in finding out, like the Volt, I can have a look into those further and we can work out whether they fit in. Yep.
My wife wants a replacement Smart for 2. And
Yes, I can't believe I didn't mention those. So those are on. Yeah, they are on. Yeah.
Good.
So that
You
and
got any ballpark on pricing for those? Because she needs a new car.
okay, one of my staff just bought one for a guy a couple of weeks ago. I'll find out for you and let you know. So this is the Smart for 2. They do.
Full electric.
We can do the full. They can do the full electric, or we can do the internal combustion. But the electric one, I'll find out for you because a guy bought one for his to go in. We had to measure it up for him because it's going in the back of his bus. So he's got a bus and it goes into the bus. I don't understand how, but and the door comes down or whatever.
For 2 now, but it's the petrol one.
Yes, that's what he's got. So he's got the current model that was sold here, and he wanted the new model in the electric. So I'll chase it up and find out for you. Yeah. All right.
Let's put our hands together.
Thank you. No worries. So there you go. Hope you found that informative.